So let's talk reverse hyper.
All right, so reverse hyper, one of those exercises I love to hate because the first time I met the machine was also the first time I probably smashed and dislocated half my neck on it. But when we're looking at a reverse hyper, so again, is it one of those machines that you're gonna find in a lot of gyms, especially in a loaded stance? Not necessarily, but you will see GHRs, you can do it with a bodyweight sense, you can add bands and things like that. But reverse hypers, again, if they're done right, I personally really find them effective for engaging a lot of the posterior chain from lower back, glutes. Just making sure that you'll see in the video is like you're loading the plate in the right position, because otherwise, again, from personal experience, if you load it distally, so you put that plate on the furthest pin and you drive up too fast, the whole thing flips over.
Yeah, and I think that's just going to be an issue mainly if people are using Atlantis, because if they're using most reverse hypers aren't going to be built like that, so it's a bit of an odd machine, a little bit different. But one of the things is with everybody looking to grow big booties these days, like that's become the new abs as girls building their booties. They tend to utilize hip thrusts and like supine hip thrusts, and that's been like the exercise of choice. And I think a lot of it's because they can load a lot of weight and they think it looks for the gram. But what they need to understand is they're only working part of the fibers of the glute complex, and they're not working really hitting a lot of glute med and some of the upper fibers of the glute. And that's something that the reverse hyper does really well. So even like looking at a scheme of periodization of doing some hip thrusts, but also doing some reverse hypers. And if you don't have a reverse hyper, very simple to do. If you've got a glute ham raise, you can do them off the back of the glute ham raise. So if you turn backwards on the glute ham raise and then extend your legs, then you can easily build up reps like that. And one of the things I like to do is take like a yoga strap or a band, and we run that through the middle of a plate and then put the ends of the band or the ends of the yoga strap onto the outside of the legs, and that allows you to load the plate in the middle leg so you don't actually have to hold the plate on. And so you could endlessly do a more of a not of a machine, but more of a body weight style reverse hyper, and you can load that up as high as you wanted to over time.
Now, I think that's interesting because you mentioned there as well about the hip thrusts, and I think hip thrusts, yes, especially a barbell version, have become kind of the go-to if someone says, I want to work on my posterior, my glutes, whatever it may be. But exactly as you said, there's only so many positions you can put your feet in when you've got a barbell refraining or loading through your pelvis itself. Whereas when you're on the actual glute ham raise, the reverse hyper, you can actually turn the feet into different positions a lot more easily without that risk of where that shear force is coming down on the hips.
But as well as when you're looking at things like hip thrusts, you're basically loading the movement in the contracted position. Whereas when you're doing in the reverse hyper, you can actually move it into the lengthened position so you can get the entire range of motion instead of just getting a partial range of motion with a hip thrust.
Something I do find effective as well is that, like, if you're thinking about trying to create areas where you're working through shortened ranges of motion into lengthened ranges of motion. If you're working, let's say you do a barbell hip thrust on the floor, then you work over into the actual reverse hyper itself, especially if you're only able to do body weight, but you're able to come all the way up, spend a portion of time holding in that contracted position, go all the way back down, making sure they're thinking about bringing the knees forward. Not so much if you see in the video, like we're restricted by what the actual machine can pivot to. But if you've only got a GHR available, then you can drive the knees in a lot closer, then actually push everything all the way back out.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that on hip thrust and also on a reverse hyper, there's no extra points for overextending the hips. So what you'll see a lot of people do is on the reverse hyper, they'll try to get their legs up as high as possible. What we should be doing is looking at what a normal range of extension is and making sure that if your body hits here, that your legs are just extending to where it's loading the glute. If you start overextending, you're gonna start loading the lower back instead, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Reverse hyper. You like the wink? The wink was good, eh?